We normally take ourselves to know many things. You know that you are watching this video right now. You know that the sun will rise tomorrow. You know that 2 + 2 = 4. Or do you? Couldn't the question always be asked, how do you know? The branch of philosophy known as epistemology is an extended attempt to answer this question. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. But just what is knowledge? The traditional definition of the word is justified true belief. Each element of this definition is important because unless all are fulfilled, then knowledge does not obtain. Think about it. If I don't believe something, then I certainly don't know it. If I believe something but it isn't true, then I still don't know it. Furthermore, if I believe something but do not have any reason or justification for it, then even if the belief turns out to be true by sheer luck, I still don't know it. Therefore, each condition must be met in order for you to have knowledge. You must justifiably believe something which is true. Everyone holds beliefs, and everyone wants their beliefs to be true. But just how are we to know that one belief is likely to be true and another is not? We know which beliefs are more likely to be true through what is known as justification. Justification is simply some sort of reason or evidence which indicates that a belief is likely to be true. That sounds simple enough. However, not everyone is so easily satisfied. What if someone claims that absolutely none of our beliefs are actually justified? This would lead to the unhappy conclusion that we have no justified beliefs and therefore that knowledge is impossible. Those who take this position are known as epistemic skeptics. Skepticism is the thesis that knowledge is impossible, or at least unattainable. A good epistemology must be able to stand up to skepticism. If an epistemology cannot beat skepticism, then it fails in establishing the reality of what it is supposed to study, namely knowledge. But why should we even consider skepticism in the first place? Why should we take seriously the possibility that we may not know anything at all? To this question, the skeptic points to the infamous regress problem. This problem emerges from the observation that many of our beliefs are inferred from other beliefs. For example, say my belief that Rome burned in 64 AD is justified by my belief that the historian Tacitus records it, and my belief that Tacitus records it is justified by my belief that my teacher said this in class. And my belief that my teacher said this in class is justified by my belief that I remember my teacher saying this in class. But what justifies this belief? How far back can justification go? And when it ends, how is the most foundational belief itself justified? And if it is not justified, then how does the original belief get justified? And if we have no answer to these questions, then it seems that none of our beliefs are in fact justified. This is the essence of the regress argument for skepticism. How can this argument be answered? There are broadly 4 answers: contextualism, coherentism, infinitism, and foundationalism. Contextualism says that belief chains terminate with beliefs that are not themselves justified. Coherentism says that belief chains loop back on themselves for justification. Infinitism says that belief chains extend back infinitely. And foundationalism says that belief chains terminate with beliefs that are themselves justified. In the remainder of this video, we will examine the first 3 alternatives and see that none of them adequately solves the regress problem. We will conclude by seeing that foundationalism is the only theory of justification which can hope to avoid skepticism. First, let's turn to contextualism. Contextualism solves the regress problem by denying that a regress of reasons needs to terminate with a belief that is itself justified. Contextualism says that justification is a matter of context. It makes no sense to speak of a belief being justified in the sense that skeptics seem to think. A belief chain may terminate in a belief that is not justified by any further beliefs as long as the belief is acceptable in the context of the believer. There is no context-independent justification to be had. What justifies a belief for one person may not justify the same belief for another person. As Baumann says, according to contextualism, the truth conditions in the meanings of sentences involving terms like knowledge, know, sentences of the form S knows that P, can vary with the context of the speaker who is uttering the sentence. It is important to note that contextualism does not believe that just any and every belief can arbitrarily be chosen as the terminus for an epistemic chain. Rather, they identify an acceptable terminus as being an assumption of a community of believers. Obviously, this means that the justificatory status of any given belief will vary from one context to another. Immediately, the question arises, what determines which assumptions within a community qualify as a terminus for an epistemic chain? Disagreement prevails within every community, and not everyone shares the same assumptions. So whatever criteria is selected for determining which assumptions are acceptable cannot itself be determined contextually. Another problem for contextualism arises when we consider the question of how any given member of a community becomes aware of the acceptable assumptions in his community. Just how is someone supposed to be justified in believing that one assumption is contextually acceptable and another is not? It seems that people must rely on evidence in order to acquire this information. But then it is evident that communal assumptions are no longer the terminus for an epistemic chain. Contextualism simply has no way to explain how a consensus becomes known to an individual. As Paul Moser observes, a person must first acquire a justified belief about what the relevant community agrees on. And of course, one can ordinarily do this only by reading and considering whether these views are widely agreed upon and true given one's evidence. But this means that one's justified beliefs about whether something is supported by a consensus must somehow be based on one's own experiential evidence, for the only way one can acquire good reasons to believe anything about such a consensus is by means of one's own experience. Finally, and most importantly, contextualism has no objective connection to truth. Just because an assumption is widely held is no guarantee that it is true. The contextualist can offer no justification for his overarching theory without abandoning it. As such, contextualism really gives no answer to skepticism at all. It simply assumes its criteria and thus begs the question. Therefore, it does not solve the regress problem. Seeing that contextualism is not very realistic, many philosophers have sought refuge in coherentism. Coherentism sees coherence as both necessary and sufficient to justify a belief. If a belief coheres with one's other beliefs, then it is justified. If a belief is in conflict with one's other beliefs, then it is unjustified. A common illustration is a web. Each strand in a web helps to support the others, and all mutually support one another. Coherentism sees beliefs in this way. No belief is more foundational than another. All support each other and can't be justified apart from the set. Laurence BonJour, in his classical defense of coherentism, explains, the presumably finite system of justified empirical beliefs can only be justified from within by virtue of the relations of its component beliefs to each other. Thus, coherentism attempts to escape the regress problem by suggesting that the problem is founded upon the fundamentally incorrect idea of linear justification. No beliefs are justified in isolation from others. One problem that plagues coherentism stems from the observation that there can be multiple, mutually exclusive, coherent sets of beliefs. How could we tell which one is true if coherence alone is enough? Jeffrey Whitman observes, the standard objection to any coherence theory of knowledge revolves around how one's system of belief hooks up to the truth. One can come up with any number of coherent belief systems. It seems that in order to determine that one coherent set is more likely to be true than another, there needs to be some criteria other than coherence. But if this is required, it becomes evidence that coherence is no longer sufficient for justification, and that therefore coherentism fails. Perhaps the most serious difficulty for coherentism is the isolation problem. This problem emerges from the observation that if coherence alone is sufficient for justification, then you may be justified in believing a proposition simply because it coheres well with your other beliefs, even if the proposition is contradicted or rendered extremely improbable by the evidence. The thrust of this objection is that since coherentism completely detaches us from specific evidence, virtually any belief may become justified as long as it coheres with the others. As Paul Moser says, coherentism seems not only to neglect the epistemic relevance of the contents of one's non-propositional sensory and perceptual states, but also to allow that one can provide empirical epistemic justification for virtually any proposition, simply by formulating a coherent belief system into which that proposition fits. These are clearly unacceptable consequences of epistemic coherentism. BonJour is all too well aware of this objection, and he responds by positing what he calls an observation requirement. He says, a coherence theory of empirical justification must require that in order for the beliefs of a cognitive system to even be candidates for empirical justification, that system must contain laws attributing a high degree of reliability to a reasonable variety of cognitively spontaneous beliefs. Thus, BonJour attempts to escape the isolation problem by positing that non-inferential, spontaneous beliefs can provide the candidate beliefs which will ultimately be justified through coherence. But there is a serious problem with BonJour's proposal. It requires that each and every belief has the same epistemic status regardless of how it is formed. Thus, spontaneous beliefs brought about through the senses are allotted the same status as beliefs brought about through wishful thinking or conjecture. But clearly these types of beliefs are not on equal footing with one another. Therefore, there must be a way to distinguish which types of spontaneous beliefs are candidates for justification and which types are not. But if such a restriction is necessary, then coherence is no longer sufficient for justification, and therefore coherentism is shown to be a failure. As Moser responds, to provide the needed restriction on the set of epistemically relevant spontaneous beliefs, we must introduce a criteria other than coherence. It is telling that BonJour himself has come to reject his own solution and to reject coherentism. In more recent work, he concludes by saying, unfortunately, however, this sort of response seems to succeed to the extent that it does only because it tacitly appeals to a direct awareness of one's own actual beliefs and their occurrence that is not legitimately available to the coherentist. This surely suffices to make clear beyond any reasonable doubt the untenability of the central coherentist view. Since both contextualism and coherentism face insurmountable problems, some philosophers have begun to consider the possibility that belief chains may actually extend back infinitely. This position, known as infinitism, is extremely unpopular. But Atkinson and Peijnenburg are optimistic, saying, the regress problem is not a genuine difficulty since infinite chains of reasons are not as troublesome as they may seem. Initially, this seems too bold, since, as finite beings, we cannot be aware of an infinite number of justifiers. This seems to immediately preclude infinitism as a genuine option. However, infinitists do not maintain that chains of beliefs are ever actually infinite, but only potentially infinite. As Peter Klein clarifies, infinitism does not require that we hold an infinite number of beliefs. Infinitism does require that there be an infinite non-repeating set of propositions, each of which is an available reason for a preceding one. But is it realistic to think that a potentially infinite number of reasons could ever really justify a belief? It seems that it cannot. If an epistemic chain never comes to an end, then any given belief is only justified if the supporting beliefs are justified. This entails that the belief chains are only conditionally justified. And if a belief is conditionally justified, this means it is only justified if some further belief is decisively justified. And since infinitism denies that decisive justification ever happens, it follows that an infinite conditionally justified epistemic chain is, in fact, not justified at all. As Stephen Porter observes, there will always be one more belief that requires justification in order for the belief we currently hold to be justified. Since that next belief could be unjustified, and we have no reason to think it is justified, the justificatory force of the whole finite chain of beliefs up until that point in the justificatory process is eroded. A further problem comes from the fact that one cannot know if there actually is an infinite chain of justifying reasons. Even if it were theoretically possible that an infinite chain could be justified, it would not follow that there really is any such infinite chain. Infinitists already admit that we are not aware of the entire chain of reasons, but then what justifies their belief that this chain exists at all? Scott Aiken tries to argue that this is not a problem because the simple descriptive fact that we stop giving reasons does not imply that the reasons themselves may not continue. But this misses the point entirely. Although they may continue infinitely, they also may not, and due to the fact that we are finite, we will never be in a position to know if they actually do. Moser reminds us, Obviously, the infinitist cannot assume from the start that all the members of an infinite regress are justified, for such an assumption would clearly beg the question at hand. Thus, infinitism turns out to be nothing more than an interesting theory about what might be the case. But even if infinitism were true, no one could claim to know it. Even if the reasons do continue infinitely, the admission that we are not aware of them still makes infinitism fall prey to skepticism. Moser asks, why should anyone think the infinitist can plausibly argue without introducing external information that every member of an infinite justificatory regress is justified? This is a crucial question, and unless the infinitist can answer it, we have good reason to believe that an infinite regress is inadequate to justify its terminal member. But recall that infinitists do not believe that we are, in fact, aware of an infinite regress of reasons. So by admitting that we do not know if our beliefs are actually justified, the infinitist admits that the skeptic is one. The mere fact that a reason exists counts for nothing if it lies outside our field of awareness. Just because a reason for some belief may in fact exist, it doesn't serve to justify that belief for me unless I am aware of it. Porter is correct to conclude, the infinitist, at least when it comes to potentially infinite chains of beliefs, is a justification skeptic in disguise. So far we have concluded that contextualism, coherentism, and infinitism all fail to solve the regress problem. If skepticism is to be avoided, then we have only one option left, foundationalism. Michael Huemer states that foundationalism says that there are certain beliefs, the so-called foundational beliefs, which we are justified in holding and which do not depend on any other beliefs for their justification. According to foundationalism, beliefs come in two varieties, inferential and non-inferential. An inferential belief is inferred from or justified by another belief. For example, the belief that it rained last night might be inferred from the belief that the grass is wet this morning. A non-inferential belief is a belief which is not inferred from or justified by another belief. According to foundationalists, every justified inferential belief ultimately owes its justification to a justified non-inferential belief. These justified non-inferential beliefs are thought to be foundational because all other knowledge is built upon them. This seems to comport well with common sense, but things become difficult when we try to conceive of precisely how these foundational beliefs are justified if not by other beliefs. As John DePoe correctly notes, since non-inferentially justified beliefs provide the foundation for the whole system of beliefs to possess justification in knowledge, it is important that these beliefs are non-arbitrarily tethered to truth. But what sort of beliefs are adequate to serve as a foundation for knowledge? Classical foundationalism says that these foundational beliefs must be certain. Specifically, they must be incorrigible. An incorrigible belief is a belief which cannot be corrected. As Olaf Tollefsen says, if it is not possible that there be incorrigible truths known as such, knowledge generally is not possible. Mere belief is all anyone can have. It is important to distinguish incorrigibility from indubitability and infallibility, since it is sometimes conflated with them. An indubitable belief is one which cannot be doubted, but the mere fact that a belief cannot be doubted hardly entails that it is true, so indubitability has no objective connection to truth. An infallible belief is a belief which cannot be false, and while this gives infallibility an objective connection to truth, it has no subjective connection to truth. For example, my belief that 4,785 times 137 equals 655,545 might be infallible given the rules of mathematics. But the mere fact that this belief happens to be infallible doesn't mean that I know why it is true. I could believe something that is infallible for the wrong reasons. So infallibility alone fails to connect the subject to truth. As Richard Fumerton observes, once one understands that the mere entailment between the having of a belief and the truth of what is believed does not necessarily provide justification, one should be wary about assuming that it ever does. Incorrigibility, by contrast, has both an objective and subjective connection to truth. It guarantees both the subject's awareness of a proposition as well as the truth of that proposition. This is why the criterion of incorrigibility is so important. Thus, to recap, according to classical foundationalism, all justified inferential beliefs are traceable to and obtain their justification from non-inferential incorrigible beliefs. So now that we have a clear conception of what sort of beliefs could serve as a foundation for knowledge, the next question is, do we have any incorrigible beliefs? The classical foundationalist affirms that we do. Anything that you know through direct acquaintance is incorrigible. Some examples of this would be the belief that you have a headache, that it appears to you that there is a red car in front of you, or that you are tired. If you believe that you have a headache, no one is in a position to correct that belief. Even if a doctor thoroughly examined your head and determined that you should not have a headache, this would not change your belief. Notice that this account does not assume that your senses are reliable. If it appears to you that there is a red car in front of you, you could really be a brain in a vat being made to see something that isn't there. But this would not alter the fact that you see the red car. This belief is incorrigible. Another example of an incorrigible belief would be seeing a pencil which appears to be bent because it is in a glass of water. Even though the pencil isn't actually bent, you still see it this way. It is an incorrigible belief. Timothy McGrew says, "The same point can be extended to any sort of experience, visual sensations, tactile perceptions, apparent memories, and even rushes of emotion. In each case, there is a level at which you cannot be wrong about your experience. It has just those qualities you believe it to have." This phenomenon is what has sometimes been called the doctrine of the given. We are given certain experiences, and from these experiences we form justified beliefs, which in turn serve to justify other beliefs. A common criticism of this proposal is that it limits knowledge to present experiences. But aren't most of our beliefs based on memory? How can memory be incorrigible when we obviously remember things incorrectly all the time? This objection is misplaced because it fails to recognize that we are directly acquainted with the contents of our memories and that these contents are in fact incorrigible. So while we could absolutely be wrong with respect to what we remember having happened, we cannot be wrong with respect to the fact that we remember it in a certain way. McGrew agrees, saying, "In the memory case, there is something that I am absolutely certain about, namely that I seem to have these memories. Doubt only arises at the point where I ask whether I am remembering correctly, but these doubts would not even make sense unless I could independently determine what I seem to remember." Yet the skeptic will demand an account for how we know that we have these experiences. But this demand assumes that experiences are not justificatory in and of themselves. It assumes that experiences stand in need of further justification. But this is precisely what classical foundationalism denies. The claim is that the experiences justify beliefs on their own, and they do not stand in need of further justification. Hence, the skeptic is begging the question against classical foundationalism. Now, it is true that we cannot show the skeptic that we are actually having these experiences, but we need not be able to show the skeptic our justification in order for our beliefs to be justified. Timothy McGrew reminds us, being justified and being able to show one's justification are two different things. Tollefson is even harsher on the skeptic, saying, "The question at issue, whether anyone knows an incorrigible truth as such, can be directly answered affirmatively only by someone who actually knows incorrigible truths as such. To demand a demonstration of this is to already have rejected the claim. Of course, the skeptic claims that this is unconvincing. The proponent of foundationalism has failed to give him a good reason for thinking that anyone knows an incorrigible truth. But it should be asked if that amounts to anything more than an admission by the skeptic that he does not know any incorrigible truths as such. Is that an argument against foundationalism? Is the proponent of foundationalism somehow required to get the skeptic to grasp an incorrigible truth in order to make good his claim to know such a truth? All the skeptic can really do at this point is gripe about the sort of justification we have, But there's no reason to think that experience cannot serve to justify beliefs simply because the skeptic doesn't like that it isn't available to him. So we have direct access to our own experiences, but does this mean we are locked inside our own heads? Is there any way to be justified in believing that our subjective experiences correspond to actual states of affairs outside of ourselves? Stephen Bland argues that this is an insurmountable problem for foundationalism. He claims that, in order to avoid the devastating constellation of local skepticisms, foundationalists must show how you get from non-inferentially justified beliefs about the contents of our experiences to inferentially justified beliefs about the material world. Nevertheless, I'm convinced that although we can only have certainty with respect to our experiential knowledge, we may have probabilistic justification for believing in the external world. The strategy here is an inference to the best explanation. We know for sure that we are appeared to in certain ways. So what is the best explanation of these experiences? Laurence BonJour says, "It seems quite clear that at least one possible explanation for the experiential patterns in question is the approximately commonsensical idea that my sensory experiences are systematically caused by a realm of three-dimensional objects." But what about other possibilities? What if I am a brain in a vat and a mad scientist is causing me to see these things? What if an evil demon is causing me to see things that aren't really there? What if I'm dreaming or having a hallucination? There is certainly no way to know for sure, but each of these possibilities seems more complicated than the hypothesis that our sensations are caused by a real external world. And even granting that they have the same probability as the hypothesis of a real external world, we may still prefer the real external world hypothesis on the basis of confirmation theory. Even when competing theories yield equally successful predictions, they are not necessarily confirmed to the same degree. If a theory has a higher initial credibility, it will receive greater confirmation from successful predictions. And since all of the other hypotheses require the existence of things that we never actually see, the reality of the external world has a higher initial credibility. As such, even though we cannot say for sure that we aren't being deceived about the external world, our belief in it remains justified. McGrew concludes the matter well. We have at hand a simpler, more plausible, and therefore better confirmed explanation for our experience, that we inhabit a real world of mind-independent objects. In this video, we have examined the regress argument for skepticism. It has been argued that only foundationalism has the resources to answer the skeptical challenge. In future videos, we will take a closer look at the nature of the foundations and answer some arguments against foundationalism. But for now, I just wanted to lay out the basics of foundationalism and the motivation for it.